The Chronox Empire arrived on Earth at precisely 8 o'clock, 0 a.m. Universal Coordinated Time, their crystalline ships materializing in perfect geometric formations above every major city. Grand Admiral Precise, his metallic skin reflecting the exact wavelength of authority, stood proudly on his command bridge as his fleet synchronized their chronometers down to the quantum level. "Greetings, humans," his message resonated across all frequencies. "Your species has been selected for integration into the Chronox Empire's perfect time protocol. Resistance is futile, and more importantly, would disrupt our carefully planned schedule." In downtown Mumbai, Riya Patel was already running 45 minutes late to work, and the alien invasion wasn't helping her commute. As lead developer at Infinite Solutions, she had perfected the art of typing almost there, while still wrapped in her towel, trying to find her other shoe. The fact that crystalline spaceships now hung in the sky like enormous floating stopwatches was, in her professional opinion, just another Monday. "Traffic is absolutely terrible," she messaged her team, conveniently leaving out that she was still making coffee. "Alien invasion on the route. We'll join the stand-up in 5. Above the city, Grand Admiral Precise's left eye twitched as his temporal sensors attempted to process the chaos below. "Lieutenant Second, explain why thousands of humans are simultaneously claiming to be 5 minutes away from destinations that are geometrically impossible to reach in that time frame." Lieutenant Second, whose name reflected his tragic birth, 2.3 seconds after his scheduled delivery time, checked his instruments nervously. "Sir, preliminary analysis suggests humans operate on a temporal system that defies our most basic mathematical models. They appear to treat time as optional." In the Chronox Empire's 10,000 years of temporal dominance, they had never encountered a species so chronologically challenged. Their temporal freeze rays, designed to lock organic matter into perfect synchronization with the Empire's standardized time, were having unprecedented difficulties targeting a population that existed in a perpetual state of running late. Dr. Marcus Hayes, leading quantum physicist at the Global Institute of Temporal Studies, was ironically absent when the aliens first attempted to freeze his entire research facility. He had lost track of time feeding his cat, Mr. Schrödinger, and arrived just as the temporal stasis field dissipated, having failed to lock onto any targets. "Fascinating," he muttered, walking through the empty parking lot while simultaneously attempting to eat breakfast, check his emails, and carry out quantum calculations in his head. Their weapons seem designed to affect beings who exist in linear time progressions. But humans, he paused to sip his coffee, which had gone cold because he'd forgotten about it for exactly 17 minutes. The Chronox Empire's first day of invasion was not going according to their meticulously crafted timetable. Their attempts to freeze Times Square at exactly noon only caught tourists. All the New Yorkers were still at brunch, operating on what their temporal analysts were beginning to call weekend time, a mysterious phenomenon that seemed to bend the very fabric of space-time. Grand Admiral Precise stood before his command staff, their crystalline forms arranged in perfect temporal harmony, except for Lieutenant Second, who was exactly 2.3 seconds out of sync and trying not to be noticed. "How can they function like this?" Precise demanded, his voice modulated to exactly 440 hertz. "Our scans show humans scheduling meetings for about 3-ish and somehow arriving anywhere between 2:45 and 4:30. Their temporal variance should tear their society apart." Meanwhile, Rhea had finally made it to her office, perfectly timed to miss the third temporal freeze attempt of the day. As she settled into her desk with her second coffee, she noticed something odd on her monitors. The alien ship's energy signatures seemed to fluctuate every time someone in her office said, "I'll be done in 5 minutes." She fired off a quick email to Dr. Hayes, whom she'd met at a conference last year, which they'd both attended on the wrong day. A random question. Could our collective inability to be on time actually be some kind of temporal defense mechanism? Dr. Hayes, who had just discovered the email he'd missed from 3 days ago, stared at his screen in sudden realization. Years of quantum research, countless studies on temporal mechanics, and the answer had been right in front of them. Humanity's chaotic relationship with time wasn't a flaw. It was a feature. The first official meeting of Earth's temporal resistance was scheduled for 9:00 a.m. sharp. By 10:47 a.m., enough people had finally trickled in for Dr. Hayes to begin his presentation, much to the visible distress of the Chronox surveillance crystals floating outside the conference room windows. "Look at these readings," Dr. Hayes said, gesturing to a series of chaotic waveforms while simultaneously trying to find his other glasses, which were perched on top of his head. "Every time someone says they're almost ready, they create a localized temporal distortion field that completely confounds the aliens' targeting systems." Rhea Patel, who had arrived 20 minutes ago, claiming she'd been there the whole time, was already coding the simulation on her laptop. "It's like a distributed denial of service attack," she explained. "But instead of overwhelming their computers, we're overwhelming their concept of time itself." The conference room had become an unlikely gathering of temporal warriors. There was Commander Diana Walsh from the International Space Agency, who had never once launched a mission on its original schedule. Professor James O'Malley, whose university students had mastered the art of submitting assignments at 11:59 p.m. And most importantly, Arun Kapoor, the owner of a small family restaurant who had perfected the "be right with you" temporal loop that could stretch 5 minutes into an hour. "Our preliminary tests show that the Chronox weapons require a stable temporal reference point to lock onto their targets," Dr. Hayes continued, absently stirring a coffee he'd forgotten about 3 hours ago. "But humans naturally exist in a state of temporal flux. We don't just run late. We create our own pocket universes of flexible time." Commander Walsh leaned forward, her military precision ironically making her the least temporally resistant person in the room. "You're saying our inability to be on time is actually a defense mechanism? That humanity evolved to protect itself from temporal manipulation?" "Exactly," Dr. Hayes exclaimed, accidentally knocking over his cold coffee. "Every time a student says, 'I'll start studying tomorrow', every parent who claims we're leaving in 5 minutes, every person who hits the snooze button, they're all contributing to a massive temporal defense network. Outside, the Chronox ships were experiencing unprecedented system failures. Grand Admiral Precise's latest attempt to implement a synchronized temporal freeze across London had resulted in nothing but confusion, as most of the city was running on what they called tube time, a mysterious temporal phenomenon that made delays due to signal failure bend the very fabric of reality. Lieutenant Second's report was causing visible distress among the Chronox High Command. "Sir, we're detecting temporal anomalies we can't explain. Humans are scheduling meetings for coffee sometime, with no specific temporal coordinates. They're creating quantum uncertainties just by saying, 'Let's play it by ear.'" In the conference room, Raya's simulation was showing promising results. "Look at this," she said, pointing to her screen. "When someone says they're 5 minutes away while still in their pajamas, they create a temporal shield strong enough to deflect the aliens' most powerful weapons." Professor O'Malley, who had spent decades studying quantum mechanics but never mastered showing up to his own lectures on time, was scribbling equations across 3 whiteboards. "It's brilliant in its simplicity," he muttered. "The Chronox Empire's entire civilization is built on temporal precision. They literally cannot comprehend a species that treats time as a suggestion." Commander Walsh was already seeing the military applications. "So if we could coordinate our natural temporal displacement abilities, we could create a defense shield powered by pure procrastination." Rhea finished, her fingers flying across her keyboard. "Every missed alarm, every quick social media check that turns into an hour, every 'I'll do it later,' they're all weapons against temporal control." Dr. Hayes was getting excited now, pacing the room with the energy of someone who had just discovered that their lifelong habit of being perpetually behind schedule was actually saving the world. "The Chronox Empire has spent millennia perfecting temporal manipulation, but they've never encountered a species that's immunized itself through chronic tardiness. The breakthrough came when a Run, who had been quietly observing while definitely not avoiding the lunch rush at his restaurant, spoke up. "In my business, when we say your table will be ready in 10 minutes, we create a temporal bubble where 10 minutes could mean anything from 2 to 45 minutes. The customers exist in a state of temporal uncertainty." "That's it," Dr. Hayes exclaimed. "We need to weaponize the restaurant wait time paradox, combined with the just one more episode phenomenon, and the traffic was terrible temporal displacement field." The room buzzed with energy as humanity's first temporal defense strategy took shape. They were no longer just a group of chronologically challenged individuals. They were temporal freedom fighters, and their inability to stick to a schedule was their superpower. As the meeting concluded, 2 hours later than planned, naturally, Rhea had already coded a prototype temporal shield generator based on aggregated procrastination patterns. Commander Walsh was developing tactical applications for synchronized lateness. Professor O'Malley was theorizing ways to amplify the snooze button's temporal distortion effects. Above the city, Grand Admiral Precise watched in horror as his temporal sensors began showing impossible readings. Humans weren't just resisting their temporal control, they were somehow turning their chronic tardiness into a weapon of mass temporal disruption. "Sir," Lieutenant Second reported, his crystalline form flickering with anxiety. "They're organizing something called a casual get-together with no fixed start or end time. Our predictive algorithms can't handle the temporal uncertainty." The resistance had found their edge. The war for temporal freedom would be fought not with precision and punctuality, but with humanity's greatest strength, their perfect imperfection. And somewhere in her lab, Rhea Patel was already running late for the next breakthrough. And that was exactly according to plan. The Great Time Disruption. The first coordinated strike against the Chronox Empire began, appropriately enough, 43 minutes behind schedule. Operation Temporal Storm, as Dr. Hayes had dubbed it, was elegantly simple. They would coordinate humanity's natural temporal chaos into a weapon. Remember, Rhea announced to the Resistance Network she'd cobbled together using deliberately unreliable meeting scheduling software. The key is to promise to be on time while having absolutely no intention of doing so. The results were spectacular. When 10,000 London office workers simultaneously replied, "Be there in 5," while still in bed, they created a temporal disruption that short-circuited 3 Chronox battleships. In New York, a coordinated wave of just one more episode declarations from Netflix viewers generated a time distortion field so powerful it sent a Chronox temporal freeze ray ricocheting into space. Grand Admiral Precise was experiencing something entirely new to his species, a headache. How can they coordinate their attacks when they can't even coordinate their lunch breaks? He demanded, watching as his fleet's temporal sensors tried to process a group of university students, all claiming they'd start their essays tomorrow. Lieutenant Second's report was grim. "Sir, they're weaponizing what they call island time, a temporal phenomenon that seems to exist entirely outside our understanding of chronological progression. And don't get me started on their fashionably late tactical deployment." The Resistance headquarters had become a hub of controlled chaos. Professor O'Malley had discovered that the average human's ability to turn just a quick coffee into a 3-hour social event generated enough temporal energy to power their defensive shields. Commander Walsh had developed a strategy she called the snooze button barrage, coordinated waves of alarm postponement that created impenetrable temporal barriers. As the conflict escalated, humanity's mastery of temporal chaos grew stronger. Rita's team had developed an app that could coordinate mass procrastination events, turning humanity's scattered tardiness into precise defensive strategies. Well, as precise as something deliberately imprecise could be. The Chronox Empire's perfect temporal order was crumbling. Their weapons, designed to impose standardized time on their targets, couldn't handle a species that considered deadlines more like gentle suggestions. Every attempt to establish temporal control was met with increasingly creative forms of chronological disruption. "They've weaponized brunch," Lieutenant Second reported, his crystalline form vibrating with distress. "The temporal uncertainty of 'let's meet for brunch sometime' is creating paradoxes our computers can't process." Dr. Hayes had discovered that the combined temporal displacement of parents saying, "We're leaving in 5 minutes," while still packing bags, finding shoes, and checking if they'd turned off the stove created a defensive shield strong enough to repel any temporal attack. Commander Walsh's forces had perfected the art of scheduling decoy meetings that no one intended to attend on time, creating temporal trap zones that confused and disabled Chronox weaponry. Arun's restaurant had become a temporal fortress. "The accumulated power of your table will be ready soon," generating a field of pure chronological uncertainty. Part 5. The Final Countdown. The Resistance's master plan, Operation Infinite Delay, was beautifully simple in its complexity. They would organize the most punctual event in human history, and then have everyone run late for it. "The temporal paradox will be astronomical," Dr. Hayes explained, his excitement making him even more scattered than usual. "Billions of humans, all promising to be on time while knowing they won't be. The resulting chronological chaos could break their entire system." The plan was set for exactly noon GMT on a Wednesday. The Chronox Empire, believing humanity was finally embracing temporal order, positioned their entire fleet to synchronize with the event. Grand Admiral Precise himself oversaw the preparations, his temporal sensors ready to lock onto the expected mass coordination. At exactly noon, nothing happened. Then, gradually, the temporal disruptions began. Billions of humans, each operating on their own unique version of running late, created a cascade of chronological chaos that overwhelmed the Chronox systems. Every "on my way" text sent while still choosing an outfit, every "just leaving now" said while looking for keys, every "be there in 10" that really meant 30. They all contributed to a temporal tsunami. The Chronox fleet's perfect formation began to waver as their chronometers tried to process the impossible. A species that could somehow be simultaneously almost ready, just leaving, and 5 minutes away, while all being in completely different temporal states. In his flagship, Grand Admiral Precise watched in horror as his temporal sensors exploded in a shower of crystalline shards. "How?" he demanded. "How can they coordinate so perfectly in their imperfection?" The answer came from Lieutenant Second, who had, fittingly, arrived 2.3 seconds late to witness the Empire's defeat. "Sir, we made one crucial mistake. We tried to impose order on a species that thrives in chaos. Their temporal displacement isn't a flaw, it's their greatest strength." As the Chronox fleet retreated, their perfect temporal order shattered by humanity's synchronized chaos, Dr. Hayes, Rhea, Commander Walsh, Professor O'Malley, and Arun watched from Resistance headquarters, which most of them had arrived late to, of course. "You know what this means," Rhea said, finally looking up from her laptop. "Being perpetually late just saved the human race." "Speaking of which," Dr. Hayes added, checking his watch, "I believe we're late for the victory celebration." "Perfect timing," Commander Walsh smiled. And so humanity emerged victorious, having defended Earth not through temporal precision, but through their perfect imperfection. The Chronox Empire learned a valuable lesson. Never try to impose rigid order on a species that had turned running late into an art form. As for the Resistance leaders, they agreed to meet for coffee sometime to celebrate their victory. They're probably still on their way there now, running just a few minutes late. And that's exactly how it should be. After all, as Dr. Hayes would say, probably tomorrow, or maybe next week. Time is relative, but humanity's ability to be fashionably late is absolute.